The year is 1979, and in a private vault beneath a nondescript warehouse in the Swiss canton of Zug, workers in white cotton gloves are stacking the last of 5,000 freshly cast 100-ounce silver bars into a newly constructed chamber, whose walls are still damp with the scent of fresh concrete. Each bar carries the faint, unmistakable stamp of Engelhard, and each one represents a fraction of the largest private accumulation of physical silver the modern world has ever seen. Above ground, in Dallas, Texas, a telephone rings in the middle of the night. Nelson Bunker Hunt, heir to one of the greatest oil fortunes ever assembled, picks up the receiver and hears the calm voice of his Swiss broker confirm that the final shipment has arrived. For a moment, he says nothing at all. He simply closes his eyes and exhales, because in that instant, he knows he has cornered more than a quarter of the entire above-ground silver supply on planet Earth. What began as a hedge against the collapsing dollar has quietly become the most audacious financial maneuver since the Rothschilds financed the Napoleonic Wars, and the price charts on his desk are already beginning to resemble the jagged teeth of some prehistoric creature waking from a long sleep. Yet the story of silver's strange power over human imagination did not begin in the fluorescent corridors of commodity exchanges or the OAK-paneled boardrooms of Texas oil billionaires. It began thousands of years earlier, beneath a blistering sun on the Anatolian Plateau, where the first known silver mines were carved into the living rock of the Taurus Mountains by people who left behind no written names, only the ghostly outlines of their tunnels and the blackened crucibles in which they coaxed liquid moonlight from stubborn ore. By 2500 BC, the city of Ur in southern Mesopotamia was already receiving regular shipments of silver from these distant highlands, and the metal had become the preferred unit of account for the palace economies that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Aegean Sea. Archaeologists working at the Royal Cemetery of Ur in the 1920s uncovered lyres inlaid with silver, death masks hammered from the same pale metal, and accounting tablets that recorded payments in shekels of silver centuries before the first gold coin was ever struck. In the silence of those burial chambers, silver speaks with a voice older than gold, older than writing itself, a quiet reminder that long before nations printed paper promises, humanity agreed that this particular element, soft enough to be shaped by hand, yet eternal enough to outlast empires, was the most honest mirror of value we had yet discovered. Centuries later, in the high valleys of the Andes, another civilization would come to the same conclusion on the far side of the world. When Francisco Pizarro and his 168 men descended from the mist-shrouded passes into the Inca realm in 1532, they were not searching for cities of gold in the way popular legend remembers. They were searching for silver, because Spain's European creditors had made it abundantly clear that only silver, in quantities measured by the shipload, would keep the Habsburg Empire solvent. The mountain that would soon be known as Cerro Rico, the rich hill above the town of Potosí, rose more than 15,000 feet above sea level, its peak permanently cloaked in snow, even as its interior burned with the heat of human desperation. Within a single generation, indigenous workers using pre-Columbian mining techniques refined by Spanish engineers extracted an estimated 45,000 tons of silver, an amount so staggering that historians still argue over whether it permanently altered global climate by stripping entire forests for the charcoal needed to smelt the ore. The silver was cast into rough ingots called piñas because they resembled pine cones, loaded onto mule trains that descended treacherous trails to the Pacific coast and then carried across the Isthmus of Panama before crossing the Atlantic in heavily armed galleons whose holds groaned under the weight of what contemporaries simply called the metal of the moon. Between 1550 and 1800, more than 80% of the world's silver production came from the Americas, and much of it ended up in the distant empire of Ming and later Qing China, where silver had become the only currency the imperial tax system would accept. In this way, a mountain in Bolivia quietly financed the construction of the Forbidden City, paid the salaries of the mandarins who governed a quarter of humanity, and created the first truly global monetary standard, centuries before the gold-linked pound sterling or the Bretton Woods dollar. By the time the United States was born, silver had already survived demonetization attempts, wartime shortages, and the rise of competing metals. Yet it retained a peculiar hold on the American imagination. The Coinage Act of 1792, drafted in part by Alexander Hamilton and signed by George Washington, established a bimetallic standard in which both gold and silver were legal tender at a fixed ratio of 15:1, a ratio derived from the average market prices of the previous decade in Europe. Thomas Jefferson kept careful records of the weight and fineness of Spanish dollars, the ubiquitous silver coins that circulated from New Orleans to New York. And when the first United States Mint opened its doors in Philadelphia in 1794, the very first coins it struck were silver half-dimes, handed personally to President Washington. For the next century, silver dollars bearing the profile of liberty flowed across the American continent alongside the wagon trains and railroads, accepted by Native American tribes, Chinese merchants in San Francisco, and frontier saloon keepers, with equal indifference to the proclamations of distant governments. The discovery of the Comstock lode beneath Virginia City, Nevada, in 1859 unleashed another flood of the metal, so much that the price collapsed from $1.30 per ounce to less than $1 by the early 1870s, prompting mine owners and their political allies to lobby furiously for the continuation of silver coinage. Their opponents, concentrated in the banking centers of the East, argued that only gold possessed the scarcity necessary for sound money, and in 1873, Congress quietly passed the Coinage Act that ended the free minting of silver dollars, an act that Western miners immediately branded the crime of '73. The political firestorm that followed would dominate American politics for a generation, culminating in William Jennings Bryan's electrifying Cross of Gold speech at the 1896 Democratic Convention, a plea to restore bimetallic money that nearly carried him to the White House. Even after silver lost its monetary crown in most of the world, it refused to fade into mere jewelry or tableware. In the dark rooms of the late 19th century, silver halide crystals became the invisible scaffolding on which the new art of photography was built. And by the 1920s, the Eastman Kodak Company was consuming more silver each year than many medium-sized mines could produce. During the Second World War, the Manhattan Project quietly requisitioned thousands of tons of silver from the United States Treasury vaults beneath Fort Knox, not for atomic bombs themselves, but for the massive electromagnetic coils needed to separate uranium-235 at the Y-12 plant in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Treasury officials insisted that the silver be lent rather than sold, and every ounce was carefully weighed back into the vaults after the war. Yet the episode revealed how deeply the metal had become embedded in the machinery of modern civilization. And still the price languished, drifting downward through the post-war decades as new mines in Australia, Peru, and Mexico flooded the market with supply that seemed, for a fleeting historical moment, almost limitless. That illusion shattered on a cold January morning in 1980, when the Hunt brothers' attempt to corner the silver market finally collapsed under a barrage of new regulations and margin calls. On what became known as Silver Thursday, the price plunged from nearly $50 an ounce to less than $11 in a matter of hours, wiping out fortunes and triggering lawsuits that would drag through the courts for years. Yet the aftermath revealed something curious. Even after the Hunts were forced to disgorge their hoard, the physical silver market never quite returned to its previous complacency. Industrial users who had grown accustomed to buying the metal for pennies above scrap value suddenly found themselves competing with investors who had learned a painful but unforgettable lesson about scarcity. The price would rise and fall with economic cycles, but the baseline had shifted upward forever, as if the market itself had been permanently scarred by the realization that silver, unlike gold, could not simply sit inert in vaults. It was being consumed irreversibly in ways that no one had fully appreciated before the panic. The sentence that T was about to follow the collapse of silver Thursday now continues. The market itself had been permanently scarred by the realization that silver, unlike gold, could not simply sit inert in vaults. It was being consumed irreversibly in ways that no one had fully appreciated before the panic. And the quiet engine of that consumption was already humming in laboratories and factories far removed from the trading floors of New York and Chicago, because by the early 1980s, a new and voracious use for silver had begun to emerge from the research departments of Bell Laboratories and the nascent solar cell programs funded by the Carter administration's Department of Energy. In the summer of 1954, 3 Bell scientists, Darrell Chapin, Calvin Fuller, and Gerald Pearson, had demonstrated the first practical silicon photovoltaic cell capable of converting sunlight directly into electricity at an efficiency of 6%, a modest figure that nonetheless sent ripples through the engineering world. What few outside the material science community noticed at the time was that the electrical contacts on those early cells, the delicate fingers that carried current from the silicon to the outside world, were made of pure silver paste fired onto the surface at high temperature. Silver was chosen not because it was cheap, it never was, but because it possessed the highest electrical conductivity of any metal on the periodic table. And in the unforgiving physics of photovoltaic conversion, every lost electron is a watt that never reaches the grid. By the time the oil shocks of 1973 and 1979 turned solar energy from a scientific curiosity into a national security priority, the basic architecture of the crystalline silicon solar cell had already locked silver into a role that would prove impossible to eliminate without sacrificing efficiency that the young industry could not yet afford to lose. While the Hunt brothers were being hauled before congressional committees and sued by everyone from the Commodity Futures Trading Commission to the Peruvian mining company Minero Peru, a far less dramatic but infinitely more consequential revolution was taking place in quiet industrial parks outside Phoenix, Arizona, and in the research corridor Arstources of the University of New South Wales in Australia. In 1983, a soft-spoken Chinese-Australian scientist named Martin Green and his student Jianhua Zhao achieved a solar cell efficiency of 18% using a technique called passivated emitter rear contact, or PERC, a design that dramatically increased the amount of silver required on the rear surface of each wafer. Green's laboratory notebooks from that period, now preserved in the university archives, show page after page of careful calculations demonstrating that silver, despite its cost T, was the only material that could carry current across the newly passivated aluminum back surface without introducing unacceptable recombination losses. By the end of the decade, every major manufacturer from Sharp in Japan to Arco Solar in California had adopted variations of the same approach, and the grams of silver per panel began to creep upward from roughly 2 grams in the blocky thick-frame panels of the Carter era to 8, 10, and eventually more than 20 grams in the high-efficiency cells that started rolling off production lines in the early 2000s. No one in the financial press noticed because the total volume of solar panels installed worldwide remained trivial, less than 1 gigawatt cumulative by the year 2000, and the silver consumed by the industry amounted to less than 5% of annual mine production. It was still possible in those years for analysts at the Silver Institute to write reassuringly that industrial demand was well supplied and that photographic film remained by far the largest non-monetary user of the metal. That complacency began to crack in the spring of 2001 when a young Stanford PhD named Michael Grotzel published a paper in Nature describing a completely different kind of solar cell, one that used a dye-sensitized titanium dioxide scaffold and a liquid electrolyte, eliminating most of the expensive silver contacts that plague conventional cells. For a brief, euphoric moment, commodities traders and mining executives convinced themselves that the silver-intensive era of photovoltaics was about to end before it had properly begun. Research dollars poured into dye-sensitized and thin film alternatives. Companies like Konarka and Dysol raised tens of millions on the promise of silver-free solar power. Yet the same stubborn physics that had chosen silver in 1954 refused to release its grip. Crystalline silicon cells kept getting cheaper and more efficient, while the exotic alternatives stalled at pilot-scale efficiencies and lifetimes that no utility would underwrite. By 2010, the very year that global photovoltaic IC installations finally crossed the symbolic threshold of 20 gigawatts in a single year, more than 93% of all solar modules shipped used crystalline silicon, and the average silver consumption per watt had settled at approximately 0.12 grams, tiny on a per-panel basis, but destined to become enormous when multiplied by the terawatts that governments from Berlin to Beijing were now openly planning to install. In the high desert of Inner Mongolia, in a city called Bayotu, whose name most Western investors had never heard pronounced, workers in 2012 began erecting the first of what would become hundreds of gigawatt-scale solar module factories, whose assembly lines operated with a speed and scale that defied every precedent in industrial history. By 2018, a single company, LONGi Green Energy Technology, was capable of producing more silicon wafers in a month than the entire global industry had manufactured in the year 2005. And each of those wafers passed through screen printing machines that deposited 3 narrow lines of silver paste on the front and a continuous layer on the back with a precision measured in microns. Inside the clean rooms, the air smelled faintly of solvent and hot metal, and the only sound was the rhythmic hiss of robotic arms moving at speeds too fast for the human eye to follow. By the time the COVID-19 pandemic briefly interrupted global supply chains in 2020, the photovoltaic industry had already surpassed the photographic sector to become the largest single consumer of silver on Earth, a transition that received almost no coverage in the financial press because the price, battered by the brief economic shutdown, had fallen back towards $16 an ounce, and the old narrative of perpetual surplus still felt comforting. Yet beneath the surface, the arithmetic had become merciless. In 2019, the world installed roughly 115 gigawatts of new solar capacity, requiring approximately 80 million ounces of silver at then-current loading levels. By 2023, annual installations had nearly tripled to 345 gigawatts, and even though manufacturers had managed to reduce silver per watt by roughly 30% through innovations like multi-busbar designs and heterojunction architectures, total consumption still exceeded 160 million ounces, more than 15% of global mine production in a single industrial application. And the curve was bending upward with a steepness that no previous silver-using technology had ever achieved, because for the first time in history, governments were not merely permitting the growth of an industry, they were mandating it through legislation, subsidies, and international treaties that carried the force of survival imperatives in an age of climate instability. In the winter of 2023, a 42-year-old materials engineer named Dr. Aihua Wang stood on the rooftop of the Fraunhofer Institute for Solar Energy Systems in Freiburg, Germany, watching snow settle on the latest generation of heterojunction solar cells that her team had just finished testing. Each cell contained less than 40 milligrams of silver, barely enough to cover a fingernail. Yet the cumulative effect of that reduction across billions of cells had become one of the most fiercely guarded competitive advantages in an industry now measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. Inside the laboratory below, vacuum chambers glowed with the violet light of physical vapor deposition, where engineers were attempting to replace the remaining silver fingers with copper-plated through microscopic laser-drilled channels, a process so delicate that a single contaminated batch could cost tens of millions of euros. Wang had spent the previous decade chasing what the industry calls silver thrifting, driven not by academic curiosity, but by daily emails from procurement departments in Jiangsu and Gujarat, warning that physical delivery delays were already stretching from weeks to months. In quiet moments, she would admit to colleagues that the mathematics frightened her. Even with heroic reductions, the International Energy Agency's net zero by 2050 scenario required the world to install an average of 1,000 gigawatts of solar capacity every single year from 2030 onward, roughly 3 times the record set in 2023. And every plausible pathway still consumed more silver than the entire planet currently mined. Far to the southeast, in the ancient silver mining district of Zawar in Rajasthan, India, a different kind of anxiety was taking root. The narrow shafts first sunk by Rajput miners before the Mughal era had been modernized with German tunneling machines and South African explosives expertise, yet Hindustan Zinc Limited, the company that now operated them, was quietly warning analysts that grades were falling faster than expected, and that the richest remaining ore bodies would be exhausted within 15 years at current extraction rates. Similar conversations were taking place in the boardrooms of Cannington in Australia, KGHM in Poland, and the great polymetallic complexes of the Andes, where geologists spoke in the measured tones of people delivering terminal diagnoses. Global mine production had plateaued near 850 million ounces per year for more than a decade, and the easy silver, the high-grade byproduct of lead-zinc mines that had flooded the market in the 1990s, was steadily giving way to lower grades and higher costs. Recycling, long touted as the solution, had reached its practical limit. Only about 180 million ounces per year could be economically recovered from old circuit boards, photographic waste, and industrial catalysts, and most of that was already being captured. For the first time since the Spanish drain Potosí, the world was confronting the possibility that silver supply could not grow meaningfully again. By the spring of 2024, the first physical shortages began to appear in forms too subtle for most investors to notice. In the industrial city of Wuxi, Chinese module manufacturers quietly shifted from quarterly to monthly silver contracts and began paying premiums of 3 to 5% above the London spot price for immediate delivery. European automakers, already competing for the same refined silver needed in electric vehicle wiring and sensors, discovered that their traditional Japanese and Korean suppliers were now allocating metal on the basis of historical loyalty rather than price. In the vaults of the major silver ETFs, SLV in New York, and the smaller but growing funds in London and Zurich, registered inventories that had once hovered comfortably above 1 billion ounces began to decline at a rate of several million ounces per month as fabricators pulled physical bars to feed production lines that could not wait for the next COMEX delivery cycle. The paper market, where most trading still occurred, continued to treat silver as an also-ran precious metal driven by inflation fears and retail enthusiasm. But beneath the surface, a structural deficit had opened that was no longer cyclical. The Silver Institute's 2024 World Silver Survey, published every April with the polite understatement that characterizes commodity research, recorded a physical market deficit of 215 million ounces, the largest in recorded history, and projected that the gap would widen further as solar installations accelerated toward the terawatt milestone. In the high plateaus of Bolivia, where the descendants of the Mita laborers who once died by the thousands inside Cerro Rico now operate cooperatives under the wary gaze of Evo Morales' old political allies, miners speak openly of a new kind of bonanza. The same mountain that bled the Spanish Empire dry still contains vast low-grade reserves that were abandoned when diesel was cheap and environmental regulations non-existent. New leaching technologies using cyanide and thiosulfate solutions in sealed pads have made it possible to profitably extract silver at concentrations that would have been laughed at a generation ago. Chinese and Canadian juniors have begun signing joint venture agreements with the state-owned COMEBOL, promising investment in exchange for decades-long supply contracts that lock in today's prices. Similar scenes are playing out in the forgotten corners of Idaho, Nevada, and the Yukon, where old tailings piles and abandoned mines are being reassayed with modern geophysical tools that reveal silver missed by earlier generations. Yet even the most optimistic geological assessments concede that these secondary sources can add at most 50 to 70 million ounces per year to global supply, nowhere near enough to close a deficit that could reach 500 million ounces annually by the end of the decade if solar deployment follows the trajectory laid out in national climate plans. And so the ancient metal finds itself at the center of a convergence no previous civilization ever faced, a use case that is simultaneously non-discretionary, exponentially growing, and almost perfectly inelastic. Unlike the silver that once adorned cathedrals or back-end paper currencies, the atoms now being screen printed onto silicon wafers cannot be substituted without unacceptable losses in efficiency, cannot be recycled for years or decades after installation, and cannot be demonetized by government decree. Every watt of solar power added to the grid is a microscopic claim on a finite resource that took nature hundreds of millions of years to concentrate into economic deposits. The same sunlight that the panels are designed to capture has become, in a poetic twist no one planned, the limiting reagent in humanity's attempt to escape fossil fuels. On the evening of November 12, 2024, in a windowless conference room on the 42nd floor of a glass tower overlooking the Huangpu River in Shanghai, 23 senior executives from the 6 largest solar module manufacturers in the world signed a document that will not be made public for years, if ever. The agreement, drafted in both Mandarin and English and witnessed by 2 Swiss notaries, committed each company to joint procurement of no less than 400 million ounces of physical silver over the next 36 months at prices capped at escalating steps above the prevailing COMEX settlement. The signatures were affixed with the quiet solemnity of men and women who understood they were not merely securing raw materials. They were attempting to forestall a supply crisis that threatened to derail the central economic priority of the Chinese state and, by extension, the global energy transition itself. In the days that followed, chartered aircraft carrying discreetly numbered pallets began departing from Zurich, London, and New York bound for bonded warehouses in Ningbo and Qingdao, while the public silver price, still largely driven by algorithmic funds and retail traders, drifted listlessly between $28 and $32, seemingly oblivious to the tectonic shift taking place beneath it. Half a world away, in the high desert of Nevada, a 58-year-old mining engineer named Sarah Madrid watched the same price chart on a cracked monitor in a trailer outside the dormant Rochester silver mine and felt the old familiar mixture of anger and opportunity. The Rochester, once owned by Coeur Mining and idled in 2019 when grades fell below economic cutoff, still contained more than 300 million measured and indicated ounces in reserves that suddenly looked very different when solar buyers were willing to forward contract at $40 and rising. Madrid had spent the previous 18 months quietly reassembling the old workforce, men and women who had scattered to oil fields and lithium projects, promising them not just jobs, but equity in whatever came next. By early 2025, earth-moving equipment painted in fresh Coeur livery began chewing into the sagebrush-covered pit again, and the first loads of ore rumbled toward a newly refurbished leach pad, whose plastic liner gleamed black under the desert sun. Similar resurrections were occurring at the Candelaria in Nevada, the Escobal in Guatemala, quietly restarted after years of community blockade, and the San Cristobal in Bolivia, each mine a ghost brought back to life by the same invisible hand, now reaching from the solar factories of Asia. Yet even as new and restarted mines added their modest increments to global supply, the arithmetic of the coming decade refused to bend. The most authoritative forecasts, those published jointly by the International Energy Agency Bloomberg-NEF and the Fraunhofer Institute, converge on a single inescapable range. Between 2025 and 2035, the world must install between 7 and 9 terawatts of new solar capacity to remain on a pathway compatible with 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. At current metallization rates, even after heroic thrifting pushes the industry to below 30 milligrams per watt by 2030, that volume of deployment will require between 5.5 and 7 billion ounces of silver, 6 to 8 times the total amount of silver ever mined in human history that still exists in above-ground form today. The implications unfold with the cold clarity of physics. Either the solar industry succeeds in replacing virtually all silver with copper or some other conductor within the next 8 to 10 years, or the price of silver must rise to levels that ration demand through economic pain, or the energy transition itself slows to the pace that remaining silver supply will allow. Inside the research consortiums that now operate with the urgency of the Manhattan Project's metallurgical labs 80 years earlier, scientists speak in hushed tones about the copper plating breakthrough that has become the single most valuable unpatented technology on Earth. At the laboratories of Meyer Burger in Switzerland, Longyi in Xi'an, and the U.S. Department of Energy's National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Colorado, pilot lines are already producing G-heterojunction and TOPCon cells with less than 5 milligrams of silver by using laser-patterned insulation layers and electrochemical copper deposition in place of screen-printed pastes. The technical hurdles are no longer fundamental. They are mundane and expensive, yield losses from pinholes, adhesion failures, long-term corrosion risk. But the economic incentive has become overwhelming. Every milligram removed is worth roughly 1 cent per watt at current silver prices, and when multiplied across a multi-gigawatt factory, the savings run into hundreds of millions of dollars per year. By late 2025, the first commercial factories announced silver loadings below 20 milligrams per watt. And the Silver Institute's 2026 survey records the first year-on-year decline in photovoltaic silver consumption despite record module shipments. The relief is palpable in mining company boardrooms and central bank vaults, but it is the relief of a patient whose cancer has shrunk rather than disappeared. The tumor is still growing, only more slowly. Meanwhile, in the physical vaults that underpin the ETF complex and in the allocated accounts of industrial users, the great drainage continues. Between January 2023 and December 2025, more than 450 million ounces disappear from London and New York registered stocks, an exodus that occurs with almost no upward pressure on the quoted price, because the COMEX warehouse system allows the same bars to be rehypothecated multiple times, and because Chinese demand is met directly from refineries rather than through Western markets. By the spring of 2026, the ratio of paper claims to physical metal in the major ETFs approaches levels not seen since the final days of the Hunt Corner, and knowledgeable traders begin moving allocations into smaller, fully allocated vaults in Singapore and Zurich, where every ounce is weighed and photographed individually. The retail investing public, conditioned by decades of false dawns and manipulated takedowns, remains largely oblivious until the day in early 2027 when the price fixes above $100 for the first time since 1980 and refuses to retreat. In the years that follow, historians will argue over the precise moment when the old world of abundant, underpriced silver quietly ended. Some will point to the Shanghai Agreement of 2024, others to the first terawatt-scale copper plating line that came online in Anhui province in 2026. Still others to the Nevada and Bolivian mine restarts that briefly flattened the supply curve before geology reasserted itself. But those who were paying attention will remember it as the period when humanity discovered that the same metal that once financed empires and ignited revolutions had become the unexpected choke point in the greatest technological transformation since the Industrial Revolution itself. Silver, the eternal also-ran, the monetary relic, the industrial afterthought, had waited patiently through centuries of neglect for the one moment when the survival of industrial civilization would depend on its unique properties. And in that moment, it began to exact a price that no one, not the Chinese Politburo, not the hedge funds of Connecticut, not the solar engineers of Freiburg, had fully anticipated. The solar crunch is no longer coming. It is here. And the metal that has outlasted every currency, every empire, and every previous technological wave is about to remind the world why it was once called the king of metals after all.